My name is Vanessa Teague. My talk is about proofs that look like proofs, but are actually not really proofs. This is joint work with Thomas Haynes, Sarah Jamie Lewis, Eleanor McMurtry, and Olivier Pereira. The idea of something that looks like a proof but isn't really a proof goes back a long, long way before cryptography. So here's a super simple example. Right? You could look at this thing and it says, suppose A equals B, and then we get to the end and it says 1 equals 2. So you know that there's something that you didn't check. And if you stare at it for probably not very long, you'll see it's this divide by zero case here. So it kind of looked like a proof, but it really isn't a proof because there's a specific assumption that we forgot to check for. If you had a certain kind of childhood, you've probably seen a lot of these and enjoyed yourself trying to find exactly the hidden assumption or unstated check that you forgot. Here's a somewhat more subtle one, which is some people attribute to Lewis Carroll. It's a proof that every triangle is isosceles. And if you've never seen it before, you might like to stop the video and stare at it for a little while. If you have seen it before, you probably know that the thing to check is, hang on a minute, what if this point assumed to be inside the triangle is actually right on the line? And then you can see that the whole proof falls apart and the triangle isn't really isosceles. So what does this have to do with cryptography? Well, it has a lot to do with cryptographic proofs like zero-knowledge proofs and zero-knowledge arguments. Because sometimes a thing that looks like a cryptographic proof and passes verification actually isn't a true proof of the stated fact. If you think about why this might fail, it's really a function of the verification specification, not the proof generation itself. Did you check, does your verification spec check for the divide by zero? Does it check for all possible cases? Does it actually make sure that the soundness conditions of the proof are being verified? In this talk, I'll show you how to prove a bunch of things that are not true, but nevertheless pass verification for a variety of different kinds of cryptographic proofs. We're going to look at a proof of a shuffle, a proof of proper decryption, and a proof of plaintext equivalence. It happens that all of my examples come from e-voting because that's my thing, but there's no particular reason to think that similar kinds of problems might not be apparent in other zero-knowledge proofs and similar kinds of protocols in use in all kinds of different systems like cryptocurrencies or online auctions or digital ID. So my first few examples come from the Swiss electronic voting system. The Swiss e-voting project, which is an internet voting project, is one of the oldest and, in my opinion, probably best regulated e-voting projects in the world. However, if you were paying attention back in early 2019, you would have seen that the Federal Chancellery and SwissPost announced that they were suspending e-voting and it wouldn't be available in the upcoming May elections. It hasn't been available since, due to a series of errors we found in the verification protocol for the proofs that were supposed to be part of that system. I'm going to tell you a little bit about exactly why. In order to understand the implications of the errors we found, I need to explain a little bit about how the Swiss internet voting system worked, or works. The idea is it's kind of a hybrid between a paper and an electronic system. Each Swiss voter receives, before election day, a paper mail-out with some unique codes for each of their options in each choice they've got on election day. So there's a little example here on some referendum question in which they've got a code for yes, a code for no, and a code they should expect if they left that question blank. This comes in the paper mail. When they want to vote, they vote online through a web browser or an electronic system that sends in an encryption of their intended choice. If this person is voting no, it gets received by what's called a control component, and a series of control components works together to receive the votes and then regenerate the codes and send them back to the voter. So the voter is supposed to check that the code they receive electronically matches the code printed on their paper code sheet for the choice they made. So then all the encrypted votes are sent to a different set of authorities called mixed servers, which are supposed to pass the encrypted votes between themselves, one to the next, and at each point they're supposed to shuffle them and partially decrypt them. Now, since there's an obvious opportunity for potential cheating here, because you don't want the people shuffling to be able to insert or delete or change the votes, the system specifies that they have to provide proof that they've properly mixed and decrypted the votes. So, in other words, that they've applied a true permutation and that their claimed decryption truly matches the ciphertext. And then finally, the decrypted votes go into the count. So we've got a bunch of assumptions here that you can already see. We're assuming that the code sheets stay secret. We're assuming that the voters verify their votes and actually check their codes. We have to assume that at least one of the control components and at least one of the mixing and decryption servers is honest. And we have to assume that at least somebody verifies the mixing and decryption proofs. So all of that would be true even if the mixing and decryption proofs were sound. Of course, if there are errors in the verification specification, then it introduces an opportunity for exactly the kind of cheating that the verification proofs were supposed to prevent. Sorry, that the shuffling and decryption proofs were supposed to prevent. Okay. So we looked at the code and the documentation that was made available under Swiss transparency regulations. And we found two bugs, one in the shuffling proof and one in the decryption proof. So let's look at them one at a time. First of all, the shuffle proof. The mixnet uses an argument of correct shuffling by Bayer and Groth. Strictly speaking, a zero-knowledge argument is different from a zero-knowledge proof because it relies on a hardness assumption, and this is going to turn out to be really important. The way it works is that it commits to a permutation matrix. In other words, a matrix that takes exactly one of its inputs and translates that exactly into one of its outputs. And it proves that it really is a permutation matrix and that it hasn't duplicated or dropped any of its input. Then, in a second step, it proves that it has applied that permutation matrix to its list of input ciphertexts. Soundness depends critically on the soundness of the commitment scheme that it uses to commit to the matrix. And that, in turn, depends on the discrete log assumption that underpins the commitment scheme. So let's look at that. The commitment scheme may be very familiar to a lot of you. It's a scheme due to Pedersen and it's decades old. It works like this. You take a public key made of random generators G and H, and if you want to commit to a message, you compute the ciphertexts by raising one of those generators to a random number that you made up yourself and raising the other of those generators to your message. It's perfectly hiding, assuming we're working in a prime field, because G to the power of R completely hides the message M. And it's computationally binding if the entity doing the commitment doesn't know the discrete log of H in base G. In other words, you're not supposed to be able to commit to one message and then at some later time pretend that you had committed to a different message. And indeed you can prove that the hardness of this thing reduces to the discrete log, to computing the discrete log of these two parameters. However, if you have a look at the algebra, you can see that if I happen to know the discrete log of H base G, then I can do exactly what a commitment scheme is supposed to prevent. I can begin by computing a valid commitment to some message M1 with some randomness R1 that I know. But then if I want to pretend later that I actually committed to some other message M2, I can use this algebra that you can see here to transform the thing that was meant to be, that started off as a commitment to M1 into an apparent commitment to M2. And if I know X, then I can compute easily the randomness that I can claim to have used when I'm claiming to have committed to M2. So I can commit to one value, prove some stuff about that value, maybe, and then I can, at some later stage, actually behave as if I committed to a completely different value in the first place. So, strictly speaking, if you look up papers about Pedersen commitments, you will see that they are called trapdoor commitments for exactly this reason, that X is a trapdoor that makes it possible to open a commitment any way I like, as long as I know the trapdoor. So what does this have to do with the shuffle proof? Well, remember how we said that the crucial security assumption here, the crucial computational hardness assumption, is knowing the discrete, not being able to compute the discrete log of h to the base g. So we started looking at the code and the specification for the Swiss e-voting system, which is made by a company called Scytl, and we looked at their key generation, not the verification, the generation, and we can see not only that they're not generating it in a standard and correct way, but they're actually explicitly generating the exponent, using that exponent to produce h, and then we're kind of hoping that they forget it. Now, there is a standard and correct way of doing this, which is roughly speaking to generate them both as the output of a hash function. And there's a FIPS standard that describes the best way of doing this. But it's basically that you generate both parameters as the output of hash functions, and then the assumption is that, assuming that those hash functions were cryptographically secure, that it's not possible then to generate two parameters that you know the discrete, such that you know the discrete log of one with respect to the other. But since it's not properly generated, the verification specification also does not make any effort to check that that these two parameters have been properly generated, and that makes it really easy to cheat. So remember, the structure of the whole shuffle proof was first we commit to a matrix, then we prove that the matrix is a proper permutation matrix, then we prove that we've applied that same permutation matrix to the ciphertexts. But if I can mess with the commitment scheme, then I commit to a matrix, prove that it's a permutation matrix, and then when I'm applying it to my list of ciphertexts, I just treat it as if it's any other matrix that I feel like. So I can basically apply any matrix I feel like to the list of input ciphertexts. I can drop some, I can duplicate some, I can make linear combinations of some, and use that to be the output of my supposed shuffle. And I can generate a proof that passes verification, even though it's entirely obvious that the votes have been manipulated. It took us a few hours to fully figure out how to do the maths, and it took us about 4 days to have it running because the code was really hard to understand and compile. Here's a little example. So this is not a theoretical exercise. We actually made demonstration proof transcripts and demonstrated that they passed both not only the verification specification, but the test verification code that was in the repository. This is one very simple example. We generated this one with zero randomness. So this is an Elgamal ciphertext. This is a series of identical Elgamal ciphertexts with zero randomness for pedagogical purposes, although it works just as well with real strong randomness. You can see that the input ciphertexts have not been faithfully transformed into the output ciphertexts. In fact, they're completely different. And yet you can go to the website at the link shown on the slide, and you can see a transcript that proves that they are in fact perfectly identical when they're clearly not. So this is a thing that looks like a proof that passes verification that actually clearly is not a proof because the votes have been manipulated. So this error gives a trapdoor in the system, breaking the verifiability of the shuffle, which was a core requirement under Swiss regulations. Exploit of the trapdoor is completely undetectable, and in fact faked proof transcripts are indistinguishable from completely honest shuffles. It's probably just a dumb mistake. On the other hand, it's exactly the kind of apparently dumb mistake that a malicious attacker would deliberately insert if they were intending to explain it away as a dumb mistake if they were found out. So we really don't know. Probably it was just a dumb mistake. And it may remind many of you of the dual EC DRBG problem, which had a very, very similar flavour, right? You have this protocol which is secure if a certain two parameters are chosen such that certain computation about them is hard. But if those two parameters just sort of appear from nowhere and you haven't got evidence that a certain computational problem can't be solved, then the system is not secure. And in this instance, we're able to prove that it can demonstrably be broken if that discrete log is known. Okay. So that was Switzerland, and that was Switzerland months before they were intending to use it. So at this point, for the Swiss, it wasn't a big deal. They said thank you, they promised to fix it. Good thing they had some genuine independent review before they were intending to use it in their voting system. Now, I may have mentioned that the vendor was an international vendor. In fact, they'd sold the same code, basically the same code, to another electoral authority in my home country of Australia. The state of New South Wales was already using it to receive votes in their March elections. This awesome headline basically says it all. New South Wales Electoral Commission confirms that iVote contains critical Scytl crypto defect, but declares it unaffected and safe for upcoming election. They'd already started receiving votes. They were intending to decrypt the votes on election day 10 days hence, but they promised that they were going to patch it in time. Okay, so that was Australia. How did this happen? Surely New South Wales has a law mandating open access to the source code so that experts can examine the voting system before election day. Well, if you're Australian, you know that this is not the case. In fact, they have exactly the opposite. They have a secrecy law that says anybody who manages to get the source code and share it with their fellow citizens to let them know how their electoral system works, if they do so without permission from the Electoral Commissioner, can be jailed for 2 years. So you can immediately see why this code, with its serious cryptographic errors, ran right up to a real election. Okay, back to Switzerland. Now we've fixed the bug, or at least we've identified the bug, which is relatively easy to fix. Everything must be perfectly secure from now, right on? Not quite, because remember this shuffle proof was actually a shuffle and a decryption proof. Let's go back and have a look at the decryption part. The decryption proof used another very well-known primitive called due to Schaum and Pedersen for proving the equality of discrete logs. Now, if you think about what it actually means to prove that an Algol ciphertext decrypts to a particular value, it's equivalent to proving this mathematical fact on the slide. You're proving that there exists some x such that, we're trying to prove that a certain Algol ciphertext is an encryption of 1. And in order to be an encryption of 1, the second element has to be raised to the same value as the secret key of the encryption system. So we want to prove that there exists this value x such that the second element of the ciphertext is the first element to the power of x, and also that's the same as the public key being raised to the power of that element from the generator, which is public. So, if we could just reveal x, then this would be super easy to check. But of course we don't want to reveal x because it's the secret key for the election system, and that would reveal how everybody voted. So we use this, again, very old and very well understood Sigma protocol for proving that an x exists in zero knowledge. I won't go into the details of how the proof works because it's the kind of thing that you've either seen 10,000 times before or you haven't. But if you haven't seen it 10,000 times before, the rough idea is that the prover picks some random values and makes an initial declaration here in step 2. And then because we want to do this in a non-interactive way, instead of receiving a challenge from the verifier, which would be normal for a Sigma protocol, the prover generates their own challenge. And they do this using a trick called the Fiat-Shamir heuristic, although many people attribute it to Blom instead. And the idea is that you generate the challenge by hashing the thing that you're claiming to be true. And then you answer the challenge just like you would in the Sigma protocol. And the idea is that if you can answer the challenge, the randomly generated challenge that you generated yourself, then you can't do that except with very small probability if you're trying to cheat. So this is a perfectly valid use of the Fiat-Shamir heuristic. Obviously it has an assumption about the security of the cryptographic hash function. But there's nothing wrong with it, except the assumption that the prover cannot choose the ciphertext. Unfortunately, in this setting, the prover can indeed choose the ciphertext. And I think I mentioned that the mixing and decryption servers were doing this kind of at the same time. So you do some mixing that generates the ciphertext. You then prove that the ciphertext you just generated has been properly decrypted by you. So in this instance, using this heuristic, in the case where the prover can generate its own ciphertext, is not secure. And you can kind of see that, you can kind of see exactly why, even if you don't fully appreciate exactly how the proof works. Because the whole purpose of computing this challenge as a function, from hashing the thing that was being claimed, was so that you couldn't go back afterwards and modify your initial claim, or modify your initial random A and B values. Except if you can choose C0 after the fact, then you run most of the way through the proof, you get to the end, you use the verification equations to solve for Z and C0. And you can see, if you look in the paper, that actually you can generate a perfectly valid proof that passes verification of a thing that is not true. So the bottom line is, make up C0 afterwards, which you can get away with because it's not part of the hash. Now again, this problem actually was already known. And Olivier Pereira and his colleagues had already written a paper about exactly the implications of exactly this mistake, which they had detected in their own electronic voting system, Helios. And they explained both what the implications were and how to fix it. It's very easy to fix, just going back to the previous slide. The simple fix is to include in the hash all of the parameters that make up part of the claim, and in particular, including C0 in the hash defeats this attack. But of course, in a context where the prover might be able to also make up G and the public key and the private key, you need to include G as well. Okay, so the implications of this are not quite as severe as the implications of the previous thing. A cheating mixer and decryptor can turn a valid vote into nonsense while providing a perfectly verifying but false proof that it decrypted properly. In this instance, it's not completely undetectable. So it would still be informally obvious that something had gone wrong because the cheating prover doesn't have complete freedom. They can only make, they can't make any plausible decryption they like. They have to end up with something that unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for Swiss election integrity, looks wrong. Again, it took us a few days to do the maths and a few more to code the exploit and check that it passed verification. And again, if you go back to that website that I mentioned in an earlier slide, you can see examples that pass not only the verification specification, but the test verifications that came with the code. In this case, informally, it'd be obvious that something had gone wrong, but formally, the faked proofs would have passed verification. At this point, the Swiss authorities were much more concerned because this bug, it turns out, affects not only the decryption proof for the system they were intending to use later, but also the vote validity proof for the system that they had already been using in past years in Switzerland. So it was actually this latter finding that really caused a profound re-evaluation of the process for certifying and analysing e-voting in Switzerland. Okay, that was Switzerland. What about New South Wales? Now, remember the last thing happened 10 days or so before the New South Wales election. This happened a day or so. This became public within a day of the New South Wales election. It seemed overwhelmingly unlikely that they wouldn't be affected by the same thing, right? Because they'd bought the same code base from the same company. Much to my surprise, however, they put out a press release saying, well, we know there's some other issue in the Swiss e-voting system, but we're confident the new issue is not relevant to the iVote system. At election time, the software was secret. There was no way, even though it was highly implausible, there was no way to either refute or confirm this claim. They did finally make the software available under reasonable terms many, many months after the election, and at that point it became immediately obvious that exactly the same bug not only had been present at election time, but was still present 4 months later. So I think there's some interesting technical lessons here, which I'll get to at the end, but I think I want to pause and think about the political lessons that come from these two different examples, the tales of two different countries that were running very, very similar e-voting systems under very, very different transparency laws. The Swiss mostly found out about their problems, mostly in advance of using the system, and they found out as a direct result of very strong transparency laws that applied to the system as it was applying for certification to be used by a very large number of voters. New South Wales, having no transparency law, but instead actual secrecy laws, didn't find out about their problems until really right up to the almost immediately before election day. And really they only found out from sheer good luck because they happened to have purchased their system from a company that had also sold a system to a country with strong transparency requirements. So I think this shows very, very strongly that particularly election systems, but also everything else important, should be underpinned by very, very strong transparency regulations, because otherwise serious bugs like this can go undetected right through a really important process like an election. Okay, so that's the end of my second example. But you might think that it's kind of easy to dismiss these problems because it's a secretive system implemented by a secretive corporation, not much independent peer review until we got to see it. Maybe only private companies that don't really know what they're doing make these kinds of mistakes. Surely a quality academic system built by people who really knew what they were doing wouldn't suffer from the same kind of mistaken assumptions, right? Well, of course, you know from this introduction this is not going to turn out to be true. The third example that I want to share with you, which is not in the Oakland paper, is from a very, very well-known academic paper by Juels-Catalano-Jakobsson, one of the most influential and highly cited papers in e-voting. It's all about coercion-resistant but provably verifiable online elections. And it has one of the first formal proofs of verifiability in the literature. There's nothing wrong with the verifiability proof. Obviously, it relies upon a certain set of components. And there's nothing wrong with the components it relies on. But there's a very subtle misalignment of assumptions between the assumptions that are used in the JCJ verifiability proof and the security properties that are guaranteed by a particular component that they use. The particular component is called a Plaintext Equivalence test, which is a cryptographic primitive that operates on ciphertexts in a threshold crypto system. In other words, we have a bunch of trustees who all share the decryption key for the votes. And what they're going to do is they want to test whether two encrypted messages actually contain the same plaintext. And they want to do this in such a way that they don't explicitly decrypt them, but they just output a bit indicating whether the plaintexts are equal or not equal. The crucial property that the JCJ protocol assumes from this primitive is public verifiability, also called universal verifiability, which means that the proof transcript should convince absolutely anybody without their needing to trust any of the trustees who are engaged in the protocol. So in particular, the proof transcript should be convincing even if all of the participants in the protocol collude together to try to fake a proof. So that's what the plaintext equivalence test is assumed to provide in the JCJ paper and the cryptographic protocol that they built. Unfortunately, this is a little snippet from the paper, and they cite two particular example papers that provide this primitive. Neither of those papers even claims to have the universal verifiability property. So I'm going to show you in a minute the protocol for reference number 26, which works in an MPC setting in which the trustees are all communicating with each other. And it very explicitly says that they assume that at least one of the participants is honest. So from this misalignment of assumptions, a primitive that assumes at least one participant is honest, put into a context in which the protocol needs universal verifiability even if all of the participants collude, we can completely break the fundamental security properties of the electoral system. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. This specific instantiation is from the Civitas implementation of the JCJ protocol. And again, I really want to emphasize, because it's important, this is by really good people who really knew what they were doing. It's a very well-known system. It's been openly available and had considerable scrutiny over many years. This is their plaintext equivalence test. And it may sort of look a little bit hard to understand, but it's actually, the concept is very simple. The proof is generated by some tabulation tellers who share the, who each have shares for the private decryption key. And they're trying to test whether the ratio of the two plaintext messages is equal to 1 or not. So what they do is they each contribute some randomness to an exponent to which the ratio of plaintexts is raised. And all these contributions are all added up together, and the result is that at the end they decrypt a value which is going to be 1 to the power of some random stuff if the two plaintext messages are equal, and it's going to be something else to the power of some random stuff if the two plaintext messages are different. So if they're equal, we should get 1 dropping out at the bottom. And if they're not equal, we should get a completely random value that reveals no information about the ratio of the two plaintexts. So the important observation is that if indeed the two plaintexts are different, then it's overwhelmingly unlikely that when we raise them to a random exponent, we get 1 and get tricked into thinking that they're equal. So that's fine, and this is secure under the assumption that at least one of the participants honestly contributes genuine randomness into the exponent. However, if they all collude together and ensure that the sum of all the random values they contribute is equal to 0, then unfortunately, the thing they decrypt at the end ends up being 1. Because they produce this trivial ciphertext 1, 1, which unfortunately is a perfectly valid Elgamal encryption of 1. So they can make the plaintext equivalence test look like a proof that the two things are equal, when in fact they weren't. And for the JCJ protocol, this has absolutely catastrophic consequences. It means that if all of the tellers collude together, they can do things like include invalid votes, because they can make it look as if a vote matched a valid credential when in fact it didn't, or make it look like a submitted credential matched a valid credential when in fact it didn't. They can also exclude valid votes, because they can make it look as if a certain person voted twice, which is illegal, and therefore exclude both of their contributions. So this completely undermines one of the two primary security goals of the protocol. Fortunately, it's very, very easily fixed just by updating the verification specification to check explicitly that the ciphertext jointly generated in this process is not the trivial 1-1 ciphertext. Okay, so just to summarize, we've seen in each of these examples a varyingly subtle assumption that wasn't actually verified by the verification specification. And in each case, we've seen that it was therefore possible to generate a thing that looked like a proof, but in fact was not a proof, and appeared to prove something that was completely untrue, that passed verification even though it was utterly false. So maybe you think this isn't very surprising, and I guess it isn't really, because lots of other cryptographic protocols have exactly the same kind of thing, right? They can have bugs and unstated assumptions that completely invalidate their security properties. In turn, when the little component proof in question is a necessary part of a larger protocol, like an e-voting protocol, the opportunity to prove things that aren't true can completely undermine the security goals of the larger protocol. And in this case, we've seen that it allows vote manipulation in each of the instances we looked at. Interestingly, the error in most cases was neither in the component nor in the protocol, but in a subtle misalignment of assumptions between the two, which again is pretty typical of other kinds of cryptographic errors, but it just goes to show it can happen in this scenario as well. So the bottom line, there are specific ways of fixing each particular thing that we found, but I think one broad take-home message for anybody writing these kind of zero-knowledge proofs, whether it's for digital ID, digital cash, auctions, or anything you like, is that really the soundness of the thing is a property of the verification spec. So if you've implemented a zero-knowledge proof recently, you need to go back and make sure that you wrote really, really clear verification specifications, and that everybody who participates in the system and needs to do the checking has followed those verification specifications very carefully. So then hopefully we won't find fundamental weaknesses that let us prove things that are not true.